Hey everyone, welcome back. In this video we are diving into Spring Cloud API Gateway. It's the critical piece that ties all our microservices together. If you've been following along, we already set up our Eureka Server and our Authentication Service. Let's see how the API Gateway can route and secure our services. Once again, make sure you subscribe and hit the bell button so you don't miss out on the rest of the series. Let's get right into it. In the previous video, what we're able to achieve was we're able to register and we're also able to log in. I have made a simple update to this particular application, and what I just did was just to add a context path, and I just changed the request mapping to user. All right, so I have pushed the updated code to the GitHub repository. You could go there and pull it if you want. To test this, we just go into Postman, all right, and just put the context path in there with the user and then the login and then all the credentials that we have. Currently, it is running on port 8080 and it's in my Docker. And when I just hit the login, it should come back with the token, which is good. We're getting back our token. It is running on port 8080. Okay, so let's dive into creating our API gateway. So first thing we need to do, this is our Eureka Server. It's still running on port 8761 and it's registered our authorization server. All right, so now let's go into spring.io and let's create our API gateway. And of course, the first thing we want to do is just make sure that it's Java, Maven, and we're using, of course, 3.3.4. We definitely need our Eureka client as one of the dependencies. And of course, we want to create our group. And then let's just name it API Gateway, which is okay. And then the description, we could just add API Gateway. Okay, Java file and Java 21. And let's add our dependency for API Gateway. Now, there are two here, the gateway and then you have the reactive gateway. Let us just use the reactive gateway. All right, and for now, let's just generate this. And we can unzip it. Awesome, so let's open it up using our IntelliJ, or let's just import it into our IntelliJ. You can just do open and just search for where it's downloaded, and mine should be here. There you go. So the first thing I want to do is, as I've said in previous videos, I like to use YAML file, so I'll change this to a YAML file, and it's pretty easy. Just change the extension. Then I want to change the structure. Good. So the next thing I want to do is I want to declare port for this. Since we already have certain ports engaged, we have 8761, we have 5432, which is our Postgres, and we have 8080, which is for our authentication server. All right, so for this one, I would use port, let's just use port 4000. Okay. So which means this application is going to run on port 4000. Okay, awesome. So the next thing we want to do is let us start declaring our routes. Our route is where the gateway is going to send our request. All right, so the first route we want to declare is our authorization server. And how does the API gateway know what route to send it to? Now, if we go back to the Eureka server, the Eureka server has the authorization server registered. So we'll be using that authorization server, authentication server, as the load balancer route. All right, so let's just declare that so you see how that is being declared. So we come here we do our Spring Cloud, and then it should be cloud, and then gateway route. Awesome. So the first thing we want to declare here is the ID, and the ID of it, definitely you can add whatever ID you want. For me, I'm just doing an auth service, which is fine. And then next thing I want to do is declare what route or what URI is the API gateway going to send the request. So I'm going to put the URI, and I'll be doing LB, which means it will be using a load balancer, right? So I'll do an LB and then // and then we go in here to copy the application name and paste it. Now let's go back to the authentication service. If you take a look at it, we have the context path, and if you go into the controller, we have the request mapping. And if we want to make calls to it, what we do is localhost 8080 API user. So we need the path to which it's going to send the request. So we're going to be using API and users. Let's just do that, right? And declare our path, right? So our path would be equal to this. Let us also just declare certain cross origins. We can do that by doing global cores, right? And then we do cross origin configuration. And then for now, as I said earlier, we're just going to make it as simple, nothing complex. So we want to allow all path for now. And the next thing we want to do is we want to allow certain origin, and we can do that by allow origins, and then we allow the ports of our authentication service. So we just do HTTP //8080. Then let us allow certain methods. HTTP methods like get, post, and put. But for now, let's just allow get and post. Let us also allow certain headers. Let's allow the content type header. Let's allow response type. And let's allow authorization. Now, what the content type does is it allows request header from the origin, right? While the authorization allows the authorization header to be sent in most cases when we are sending token. And the response type specify the type of response expected. Let us allow one more thing. Let's allow credentials. All right, so let's just keep this for now. Let's just use this for now. Let's try to deploy this into our Docker and test it. But before we do that, let's go back to the authentication service. Let's just do a copy of the Eureka instance and just paste it to make our job faster. Let's paste that here. Good. Then we also need to create our Docker file. Okay, let's just go back to the authentication service and just copy to make our job very fast. Let's just copy it. And we can just change. But before that, let's run this build. Let's just run the install. And we can, while that it's doing its thing, we can just modify the Docker file. Awesome. The jar has been created, so we can just copy the name of the jar file and then just paste it here. Good. So let's just try to push this to our Docker. And to do that, we can just do Docker build ft API gateway. All right. So let's go into the images. Is it there? Yeah, it's there. So to run this, we just do Docker run name API gateway, and then from the last time our network, we created our network and our network was on it. Looks like we skipped something in the Docker file, and that's the port. So let's export the port since we changed the port to 4000, and then we can just rebuild again, and then we can just do a -d and -p for port, and then 4000, and we want to give it the name of API gateway. All right, that should work. So let's see. Good, it's running. Good, it's updating, and it started on port 4000. So let's check our Eureka Server and see if it is registered. Awesome, it is registered on the Eureka Server. Now let's just test this. Oh, it says not found, which means we are missing something somewhere. All right, let's go back to the application and see what we are missing. Oh, at the first glance, I see that we have a path here in this predicate that is specifically just saying API/user. So what we want to do is we want to accept everything after that, and let's just try to build that again. Let's build that again. Awesome, the build is complete. Let's go to our Docker to just take it out manually. No problems. Can just stop it first. Let's stop it, and we just delete. Awesome, so let's push it to the Docker again. Let's do the build. And then let's start. Awesome. Good, it started. So let's test this again. And there you go. Our issue has been fixed. So which means we are going through our API gateway currently to our authentication service. All right, awesome. But is that all? No, that is not. It's pretty straightforward and simple. But that is not all you need. What if we want to implement the expense tracker? Currently, it's just going to simply forward to only authorization service. We need something to make sure that we have authorizations. And how to do that is adding the pre-filter or the custom filter. And what it does is it intercepts the request, performs custom logic, and then passes down the request. When it gets the request, the first thing it does is it wants to check that the route that is being called needs or do not need authorization or authentication. If it does, then it wants to check if the client is passing down a certain token or what form of authentication. So in this case, we're going to create the authentication pre-filter just to make sure that our endpoints or our downstreams are authorized. And how to do that is just by creating, let's just create a package and call it security. And then we want to create a class and we call it authentication pre-filter. Let us make this a component. Since we will be checking the tokens, I'll go to the authentication service because that's where the token is being created. I'll just copy my key store. That's the first thing I want to do. Copy my key store and put it here. Okay, and then go into my YAML file. I want to copy everything that has to do with the key store. I want to use that. And come back to my API gateway. And then just paste that here. Okay, good. So the first thing we want to do in this class is inject our key store path. Let's make it private. All right, how do you do that is to use @value, then the $sign, and then want the path to our key store path, which is key store the path. Simple. And then we also want to create for the password. Let's just copy this to make it faster. Then we just want to call this password. The first thing we want to do is create the method that loads the public key from the Java key store. All right, let's just do that. We do a private all right, and then we just want to do a key store, the Java key store, and let's just name it key store. Doesn't really matter. Equals to key store dot, of course, the instance, get the instance. We created a JKS instant earlier from the authentication service. And then let's just put a try cache here. Let's try. We want to get that particular file. Input stream. And then let's just call it input stream equals new. And then we pass in our key store path. Okay. Let's throw the exceptions here. Same thing with here. Should be good. Okay. Now, what do we want to do in the try cache? We want to load our key store. So just do our key store dot load. Then we want to pass in our input stream and our password. Awesome. Let's add the try cache, then we should be good. All right, so here, the next thing we want to do is we want to retrieve the certificates using the alias. Let's just do the alias, which we did not put in here the last time. So let's just put in the alias. And from the last time when we created the JKS file, our alias was auth server. If you don't know how to create it, please just check the previous video. I also have the lines to create this in the previous video description. You could just check that. So now let's inject our alias. Just copy this to make it faster. And we do alias key store alias. Awesome. So now we want to get the alias. Okay, store alias. Awesome. And then we want to return the cert. Get public key. Awesome. So we've successfully loaded our public key All right, there's an error here. We need one more curly brace to close this, and that's good. All right, so the next thing we want to do is, for this particular class, we want to extend an abstract gateway filter factory. All right, so to do that, we just want to do an extend. And why do we need it? So there are certain situations where we will probably want to whitelist or just allow certain URL or certain endpoints. For example, a login endpoint should not be secured because you want to log in. A register endpoint should not be secured because you want to register or you want people to register. Endpoints like the login and the register would put them in the excluded URLs. So they are excluded from being authenticated. All right, so let's just do that, and we'll create, now that we've extended the abstract gateway filter factory, let's just implement this method. All right, and then we should just take the first one, which is the apply. Let's just take the first one, which is the apply. Let's just create an inner class here to hold our config. And how to do that is we just create a class, static class config. All right, good. The next thing is, let's just add the list of our excluded URLs. Just name it excluded patterns. Let's import this. I want to use the Java util. Now let's just create a getter and a setter. Good. So from the implemented method, we can then change this to our config and then go back to the top here and then use our authentication prefilter.config. Awesome. Now for this particular line of codes that we'll be writing, we'll be using something called the reactive programming. We'll get into that as we go, but I want us to understand what each line of this particular implementation does, and I will try as much as possible to explain that. So the first thing we want to do, let's return exchange and okay. And then we want to get our request. We name it request equals exchange.getRequest. So let's just get our request from the exchange. Let's also get our path. Now this import seems to be wrong. So what we want is the reactive programming. Yep. All right. Then we also want to get our headers. So let's get the headers. Now we also want to get a token, if assuming token is available. String token equals get first headers.authorization. So the next thing we want to check is to see if the path, this particular path, is part of the excluded URLs. And how do we do that? We can do that by, you know what, let's just create another method to do that. Let's just create a standalone method just to check that. And we can do a private boolean. Let's just name it, let's just make it a boolean is excluded. And then we want to pass in the path. Then what we want to check, let's just use a predicate. All right, is excluded. Before we complete this, there are two ways you can add this custom exclusion. First one is you could add them in your YAML file. And how to do that, to pretty much do that is simple. We can just create a gateway and then we name it excluded URLs. And then we can add whatever URL we want to exclude. So for example, we're trying to exclude the API/user, for example, and then we can also maybe add another one /login, depending on what we want to do. Now, but for me, I'm just going to do this and just leave it here, and then we can go back to the prefilter. Rather than using the prefilter to do this, I'll just create a package and call it config, filter config. And here I'll create a bin let's rename this as config. And here what I want to do is I want to annotate this with configuration. And then I want to pass in a bin. And then I want to create a bin of a list of string. And then we want to call it exclude URLs. All right. So what this will do is just to return an array we're going to stream through, and then we want to get the URLs. Let's just inject the URLs with the add value. And what is that again? We have gateway.exclude URL. So let's get that. Dot exclude URL. Awesome. So what name do we give this? Let's just give it private string exclude URLs. All right. And then we just pass it here. Exclude URLs. Since we have a comma separating them, then we want to split it by the comma, and then we want to collect it to list. Awesome. But let's name this method a particular name, right? So let's just name it by using @qualifier, and then we just call it excluded URLs. Simple. All right, so let's go back to this prefilter. So the first thing we want to do is to create a list of string type, and we just use the auto wired to bring in the bin. String. You can just copy that name. Awesome. All right. So we'll go back to complete our is excluded, and what we want to do is to return excluded URLs. Then we want to stream it dot any match is excluded, right? So what this method does, it returns it true if the path matches any exclusion pattern. All right, so that's what this particular method returns. So let's now go back to our gateway filter, and then we want to use an if statement to say if is excluded definitely in the path. And then what do we want to do? We just want to return chain filter and want to return the exchange. So which means we do not want to check the token, or we do not want to do anything. If it is excluded, just exclude it and return the chain. But if it is not excluded, then what we want to do, we want to check if the bearer token, making sure that the token itself is not null. Did we get the token first? Let's see. Yes, we have the token here. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that the token itself is not null. I want to check if token is null or the token does not start with. Error. All right. Then what do we want to do here? We want to return an error, all right? But since we'll be using that error often and often, so the first thing we want to do is let's just create another method to undo that request, and then we can just name it private mono. Since we are using reactive programming, let's just do a mono, and of course it's going to return void, nothing. Then let's just name it undo auth error. Let's name it that, and then we want to pass in our exchange. We also want to pass in our message. What message do we want? Just to make it dynamic. And then we're to pass in what HTTP method or status rather. Status. Alright, good. Alright, so the first thing we want to do is we want to get the response first off. HTTP response. Exchange that get response. Awesome. The next thing we want to do is to get or to set the status code. So we want to do a response dot set status code with our status. All right. The next thing we want to do is set the content type. All right. So how do you do that? We want to do a response dot get headers dot set content type to be media type dot. Let's just set to JSON, application JSON, right? Simple enough. And then now let us build our response. To build our response, we use a map. Let's import the map. All right, the map will take a string and an object, actually, and then we just want to name it whatever you want to name it. I'll call it response body, for example, and then equals new hash map. All right, so what do we want here? The first thing we want is we want the time, and then I probably want it in a zone time. So let me change this spelling. We have a spelling error here. Okay, so we want to, the first thing we want is the time at which we have the error. So we want to do a response body dot put. Let's just put the time, and I'll probably want to use the zone time, so we'll name it a time stamp. All right, and then okay, zone time dot let's do now, definitely. Not format. So in what format do we want it? Then formatter dot the pattern of which we want it. So I want it in year, month, day, hour, minutes, and seconds. So I'll just do 1, 2, 3, 4 for year, for month, DD for day, with a space, hours, minutes, and seconds. That solves it. Awesome. Okay, there's an error here, and that's because of the data type. So object, good. All right. So the next thing I want is what's the message, right? We want to build the message. So I want to do dot put the message And the next thing is the status. We need the status itself. Then we want to put status, and then we want to get our status the value, right? The next thing we want is the error code itself. All right, and then we add the status dot value. All right, good. And the next thing we want to do is we want to write this as JSON, but to do that we need object mapper. And before we can actually use object mapper, we need to create a bin of the object mapper and make sure that the object mapper maps correctly. All right, so let's go back to the filter config, and we can do that. Let's just create a bin of the object mapper, and you just do a public object mapper. All right, so the first thing we want to do is we want to create a JSON factory, which is used to create JSON parsers and generators. So let's just create JSON factory, name it factory. New factory, awesome. So the next thing we want to do is just configure our factory. And what do we want? We want to do factory.configure. And the first thing we want to configure is to ignore unknown JSON properties. And how do you do that? You do JSON generator dot feature dot ignore unknown. All right, and we set it to true. Next thing we want to do is to create the object mapper instance using the JSON factory we just configured, right? So how do you do that? We just do object mapper equals new object mapper, and then we pass in our factory. So the next thing we want to do is to configure the object mapper not to fail if there are properties that are explicitly ignored during this serialization. So how do you do that? You want to do object mapper dot, let's configure that and do this serialization fail on ignore. Let's look for that properties, and then we name it, we set it to false. Awesome. Also, let us set the deserialization fail on unknown properties so that it doesn't fail when there are unknown properties in it. So we just configure that deserialization fail on unknown properties. Let's look for that. Fail on unknown properties. Where's that? There it is. Then we call it we set it to false. Let us also set it to unwrap root properties. And we set it to true. Next thing we want to do is set our date format. So we want to set our date format to the same date format we had earlier. So to do that, we want to do new simple format, and then we want to pass in our string for y to m to d's hh mm and ss. All right, and then we want to return our object mapper. Good, let's go back to the authentication prefilter, and then from there what we want to do is let's just do a try here to convert it to JSON. So byte array byte equals object mapper. We have not injected our object mapper, so let's just do that. Use the @AutoWired to inject. Okay, awesome. So now let's go back here to do an object mapper. We want to write value as by response body. Okay, good. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to use the data buffer to wrap the bytes into buffer. Equals. Now I want to do our response body dot buffer factory dot want to wrap the bytes. Awesome. Then we want to return response dot write with a mono. Then let us add our try cache here. Awesome. Now let's go back to return our previous error. So if the token is null and if the token does not start with bearer, what we then want to do is we want to return our error, the error we just built, and do auth error, and then we want to pass in our exchange. Definitely we want to pass in our message. What message do we want it to show? And we're saying missing authorization error. And then one last thing we need to pass in is what status code do we want it, or what status do we want it, and that should be http status. Let's use unauthorized. Good, that solves it. All right, now but what if everything seems okay? All right, so the first thing we want to do is we just want to get our token and we want to take out the bearer in front of it. And so if we count the bearer, we have 1 2 3 4 5 6 and the space, which is 7. So we want to do token dot substring just to take out and just get only the bearer token 7. All right, and then we want to do a try and get the public key. The public key. All right, let's add that to the try cache. Good. The next thing we want to do is get the claims. In most cases, the claims always include the rows and the likes, right? And whatever you add to it. Oh, it looks like we do not have the dependency. We can go into the authorization or authentication service to just get the dependencies. These 3 dependencies are what we need. The JSON web token to just get that. Just copy that and just put it into our API gateway. Awesome. Now that we have it, we should be able to import the claims. Yep, there you go. Yep, there it is. So claims. So we want to retrieve the claims. Then we set the signing key, which is used to decode or validate the token. We set the signing key to be our public key. All right. And then the next thing we want to do is we want to build. Let's just build. And then we want to pass in our claim or our bearer token, which is our token. All right. All right. From here, then we want to get the body. Awesome. Then now that we get the claims, we can get anything we want to get from that token. And the first thing we want to get here is maybe the email, for example. Let's assume we have an email in there, or maybe first name, or whatever it is we want to get. So let's just get username, for example, because claims.get subject, because our username is definitely our subject. So if we go look at the token we had earlier, let's just take a quick peek at what the token does. So let's just copy this and try to decode this. Let's go to JWT.io and try to decode this. All right, so our subject is definitely the username. You know, we have the first name, the last name, we have the role, the issuer, the expiry date, and the likes, right? So if we go back there, let's just get our username, which is test user. Let's go back and get the subject. Good. And then we also want to get the role. Claims.get, and then we want to get rows, and we get it to string. It is role, not roles. Okay, let's just change that again. Role. Good. Now the next thing we want to do is we want to modify the request by adding the email and the rows as header for the downstream service. So let's do that. How to do that is just do an exchange dot get request. You want to mutate the response, and then header will be username. And also want to add to the header, we want to add the role. And then we want to build the response. Awesome. So the next thing is to return, then want to return the chain filter. Return the exchange. Awesome. If we have errors, let's just throw the big exception class. That should cover for all this. And then we should be able to just return the handle. And then return the exchange. Invalid token, for example, as a message. And unauthorized. Awesome. And this looks good. Let's just push this code again to our Docker and try to run it again. Let's manually take it out of our container. Good. Let's just run this again. Awesome. Let's first check if it's registered yet. Not yet. Awesome, it's registered. And let's just try it again. Okay, and we're able to generate our token. In the next class, what we will be doing is creating our expense tracker, and we will be using this API gateway that we've created to secure the expense tracker, and making sure that anyone who wants to reach out to the expense tracker must have a token and must be validated. So we'll do that in the next class. All right. Once again, I'm super excited to be your instructor on this journey towards building excellence. Please subscribe, leave your comment, click the notification button to stay updated with our new videos, and most importantly, share with your friends. And I'll see you in the next video.